partidul s-a născut.
Ce știm noi din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut.
Greetings, everybody, and welcome to a special broadcast today, which is brought to you in, shall we say, emergency circumstances brought about by the US attack on Iran this morning. And I say US attack, and I'm going to be very specific as to my reasoning why this is a US attack. Forget the fact that there are Stars of David on the aircraft that carried it out. We know from accounts that have come out of US occupied Syria that the US Air Force tankers refueled Israeli aircraft over that country. And without that, then the Israeli aircraft would not have been able to reach their targets inside Iran. So bear that in mind. That's direct evidence of US participation in this. Also, the weapons are supplied by the US. The intelligence, again, to be used to find the targets in Iran is supplied, at least in part, by the US. The US stands behind all of this completely. And if you believe for a moment any of the crap pouring out of the so-called multipolarists today, that there was a division between Trump and Netanyahu, etc., and Trump didn't really want to attack Iran, etc., etc. First of all, the only problem the US has with Netanyahu is that they think his brand is damaged, and he's damaging Israel's brand. As we said on the Decline and Fall show yesterday, the biggest problem they have is that they think that Israel's got a brand issue, and if they get rid of Netanyahu, they'll be able to rebrand and rescue the place. So this is standard stuff coming out of the US. There was no division because, of course, Israel remains a vital part of the US's toolbox for maintaining their presence in West Asia, and it'll only be dropped when it can no longer play that role. That time might be approaching, but we're not there by quite some distance yet. And why do I say that this is a US attack? The US imperialists require the destruction of the Islamic Republic of Iran and its return to being a land ruled by compradors like the former Shah, the former Pahlavi dynasty. They've required that since 1979, and that requirement has not changed, no matter what. It's the old phrase from Putin himself, who said the president's changed, the policy does not, meaning that the administrations in the US come and go, Democrat, Republican, whatever, but there's no change to what the US ruling class requires. And the US ruling class requires that Iran be returned to US domination. And they have tried various different ways of doing this over the last 46 years. So they've tried the approach via the long-term American investment in Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein, the killer of communists and a long-term CIA asset turned victim of American imperialism, but that happens rather a lot. They tried the Iraqi attack on Iran. The Iran-Iraq war, of course, lasted over 8 years and resulted in hundreds and hundreds of thousands, possibly over 1 million dead. That was one such idea that the US had. Others included sanctions, isolation, sabotage operations, assassination campaigns, color revolution attempts, the activities of fifth columnists and traitors inside Iran, all of which is designed to return Iran to US domination. That's what they're after. The fact that Israel is the puppet that has been chosen to wield the blade this time is not so much irrelevant as it is a evolution of the tactics used by US imperialism since the beginning of the period of the Islamic Revolution. So forget this as being some sort of Israeli attack, or that Netanyahu is out of control, or the US didn't know. No, this is a US attack which was designed inside the United States and was cooked up for many, many months by intelligence officials and military planners, while the US politicians, led by Trump, participated in a farce, which was the farce of the supposed negotiations over the Iranian nuclear program. Now, here I will, of course, draw upon the words of the great philosopher king himself, a certain Donald Trump, who had the following to say. I gave Iran chance after chance to make a deal. I told them in the strongest of words, just do it. But no matter how hard they tried, no matter how close they got, they couldn't get it done. I told them that it would be much worse than anything they know, anticipated, or were told, that the US makes the best and most lethal military equipment anywhere in the world by far. Well, that's not true, as it turns out. And that Israel has a lot of it, with much more to come, and they know how to use it. Certain Iranian hardliners spoke bravely, but they didn't know what was about to happen. They are all dead now, and it will only get worse. There has already been great death and destruction, but there is still time to make this slaughter, with the next already planned attacks being even more brutal, come to an end. Iran must make a deal before there is nothing left and save what was once known as the Iranian Empire. No more death, no more destruction. Just do it before it's too late. God bless you all. So you can tell by the incoherent, raving tone of that that's Trump himself writing. And as always with Trump, and this is his usage, he gives away an awful lot more than a standard US president would. A standard US president would be like Biden, for instance, or Obama, or George W. Bush, would be a little bit more subtle and would hide behind Israel a lot more than Trump is doing here. Trump's given the game away about what was being threatened. See, pay attention to his words, because again, he gives away far more than he intends to. So he's basically admitted there that the negotiations were designed to produce one of two outcomes, one of which would be total Iranian capitulation over their nuclear program, so that they would give up all enrichment activities, meaning they would need to import a lot of the stuff they need to use to power their civilian nuclear program, and that the US would reserve the right to turn this off, these imports off, cut them off at any point in time. What again, every negotiation that the US engages with Iran is only designed with one outcome in mind. That is to return Iran safely to the US camp. Safely in terms of US investments, not safely in terms of lives. And that's what is always in mind. It doesn't matter whether it is Obama's JCPOA or Trump and this attempt to rather crudely recreate it. And what Trump is saying here is, I think he's telling the truth, which is that they were saying to the Iranians, you better do it or Israel will attack, and they would do it. But Trump makes the truth clear, where he says that it will all be done with US military equipment. And that's true. Israel does produce some military equipment, but even that, which is mainly variants of that which is produced inside the United States. And this is the purpose of Israel. This is why the British imperialists backed the creation of Israel over 100 years ago. They backed the Zionist movement, and why the US took on the management of Israel, because this is Israel's purpose. I mean, there's a reason why. I mean, if we go back to 1967, Israel attacks Syria and Egypt in order to destroy Nasserism and Arab socialism. That's why that war was conducted, and it was conducted again at the behest of the United States. That's why Israel did it, and the British being involved in it as well. But Israel does this now to act as the tip of the spear of US imperialism. Israel was always a way of the British or the US committing grotesque acts of terrorism or genocide, whilst being able to claim that not only are they not doing it, but they're the ones who can come in and negotiate and stop the killing, stop the violence, call off the dogs. That's been the tactic with the Israeli regime from the very beginning. And I'll just go and deviate briefly into the Ukrainian situation. When Zelensky says that Ukraine wants to be a big Israel, that's what he means. Well, I don't know whether Zelensky quite understands what he means, but the people who wrote the script for him, that's what they mean. Israel's job is to sit in West Asia and attack anybody and anything that emerges that might pose a challenge to US and British hegemony in the region. That's what Israel's job is. That would be Ukraine's job, but the focus would be almost entirely upon Russia. And also anything else in the area that created trouble for US dominance. And that's the job that the British and the Americans had in mind for the Kiev regime. And the tactic is always the same. I mean, if you go back even further with the history of British imperialism, you'll see, like in their conquest of India and other places, that they would always have proxy forces that would fight on their side, that would create trouble for them, that would be that would attack their enemies, and then the British would come in and say, well, if you want the war to stop, you better give us what we want. We'll negotiate for you. And the war would stop after they gave the British what they wanted. And the American imperialists take on that tactic as well. So Israel attacks people, and the US says, well, you better make a deal with us, or you never know what those Israelis are going to do. And the illusion is that the Israelis do this on their own. But Trump's just made the truth absolutely clear, which is the Israelis will do it. We will supply them with all the weaponry and all the intelligence and everything else they need to do it, but we'll be one step removed. That's why Lindsey Graham said that when it said basically in a tweet when the attacks began, it has begun, pray for Israel. Now, if you're Israeli, I'd be looking at that as a rather double-edged tweet. Because on the one hand, yes, they'll be screaming and cheering for you. But on the other hand, it does rather reveal the US's hand again, which is that Israel is the means by which the US exercises its aggressive intentions at the moment. They don't want to do it themselves openly and directly, even though everybody in the world with eyes and a functioning brain, except perhaps for some elements within the Iranian government, but we'll get to those later, that Israel is used like that, and eventually, if the Israel is no longer useful in that respect, then Israel will be discarded, just as eventually Ukraine will be discarded. But for now, Israel still has its usages for the US, which is why they are maintaining this regime. So this was a US attack. It was a US attack on Iran, which is completely within the US and British way of war. Now, what is the US and British way of war? I've done streams on this before, but to reiterate briefly, the US way of war, and this is where it is similar to the operation that has been done against the Russians, isn't to send vast armies in and fight. That was never what they were going to do with Iran, because it would be, if not impossible, it would be extremely difficult, extremely costly, and would create enormous political problems back home in the United States. If they sent 1.5 million men in to invade Iran, it would be a disaster for them. So that's not the way that they were ever going to go at Iran. That's not possible for the US to carry off. So what is the US way of war when faced with these very real limitations on their own power? That they can't mobilize 1.5 million men. They can't march into Iran. They can't, just the same way they can't march into Russia and they can't march into China, or for that matter, the DPRK, People's Korea. So if you can't do that, then what's the other way? The other way around that is that they're using with Iran now roughly the same kind of operation that they have attempted and so far failed to carry out, using Ukraine against Russia. So this time it's Israel being used against Iran. Now, what's been done by the US attack is mainly that they've struck at Iranian nuclear targets, but we're not completely clear on how much damage has been done. Certainly not the kind of damage that would take out the Iranian nuclear program in anything like the degree that would be required to cripple it completely. It doesn't look as if they've managed to do that much damage to the Iranian nuclear facilities. Again, we're still unclear as to exactly how much damage has been done. We will find out for sure in the next few days. But the main focus of the US attack on Iran has been a targeted assassination policy. So there's at least 20 or so senior Iranian military leaders who have been killed overnight. Now, that in itself represents a significant, but by no means devastating, tactical victory for the US, in that they managed to take out all of these very senior Iranian military officials all at once. Now, that raises a lot of rather troublesome questions. If I was Iranian, I'd be asking my government the rather obvious question, which is why, when so many people in the US political hierarchy were openly threatening war, was the entire Iranian military leadership out in the open and able to be killed all at once? Because that's a significant failure on behalf of Iran, on top of other significant failures of the Iranian leadership that we will get to later on. But it's mainly an assassination strategy and an attempt at a decapitation strategy. So what military and broader political objectives are we looking at here? Why has that been chosen as the main method of attack? They're also attacking other things. They're attacking air defense systems. They're attacking airports. But what is the aim? The principal aim here, by attempting a decapitation of the Iranian military and attacking like high-value targets. The aim of this is to trigger a political crisis within Iran itself. That's the target. Now, as I said, the US knows very well that it can't march into Iran and try and conquer it old school style. So to conquer a country now, particularly one the size of Iran and with the potential power of Iran, you can't just march in and raise the stars and stripes over Tehran. That wouldn't work. So what you do is that you do a more clever, more devious approach. You try to trigger internal collapse with regard to Iran. You try to trigger an internal collapse by causing a crisis of confidence amongst the Iranian population, but more specifically, you target for assassination those elements within the Iranian government and military and security state that are, as Trump put it in his Truth Social post, the hardliners. Now, Vanessa Beeley, the journalist who's covered the Syrian crisis extensively, somebody whose reporting I sometimes vehemently disagree with, but she made a good point on Twitter where she said that the decapitation strategy is all aimed at people who would be those so-called hardline elements, people around or in the political orbit of the Iranian supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. And the aim is to weaken the revolutionary and patriotic elements within Iran and to strengthen those elements that are weak, that are treacherous, and are looking to capitulate rapidly to the United States. So that's part of the aim. And the aim with these operations isn't a belief that the US has that they're suddenly going to cause a collapse just by bombing. You combine targeted assassination with attacks on key pieces of infrastructure with a massive campaign of psychological warfare, which is what we're in the middle of right now, by the way. Every time the US does some kind of military maneuver, it's accompanied by a massive and global operation in psychological warfare. Now, until the smoke's quite literally cleared, we won't know exactly how much damage has been done to Iran and its ability to respond to the US, because right now we're in the middle of information warfare, and that's why I would be very cautious about accepting reports that don't come from solid and dependable sources. The US is absolutely flooding the space across the entire internet with false reports, routinely hyping up the damage that they've done. Now, they have undoubtedly done a great deal of damage, but we will have to be patient and wait to see exactly what has been done. One of the reasons why they go in for these type of operations and why it's backed up with massive psychological operations is to try and trigger a collapse in their enemy's will to fight without actually having to commit their forces or do much of anything. This is why, by the way, the Ukraine war is run the way that it is. What people look at the tactics used by the Iranians and say, well, this doesn't make any sense. Why are they launching raids into Kursk? Why are they, doing drone raids on Moscow, etc.? It is because this isn't a war fought for the benefit of Ukrainians or Ukrainian nationhood, of course, or anything like that. It is a war fought according to the methods of the Western way of war, particularly the US and British way of war, which is that military operations are only a small part of the psychological operation. This is crucial to remember. So when Ukraine invades the Kursk region, is it because they seriously expect to be able to, the Russians will just collapse? No, but the thinking of the people who designed this is that if they combine an attack in the Kursk region with a massive psychological operation targeted at the Russians and the Russian population, they can cause a crisis within the Putin-led government, which will cause the will to fight of this government to collapse, will strengthen the comprador and treacherous elements inside Russia, or that will be combined with color revolution operations on the ground from multiple different political sources, all of which have links to US imperialism. Remember, US and British imperialism in any country will back people nominally on the left, people nominally on the right, all of which will be defined mainly by the hostility to the existing governmental system. And this is the way that the Western war works. So this attack on Iran, this decapitation strategy, these very high-profile strikes on figures in the military and scientific and technological complex on high-value targets, is it because they expect that this will cause a military collapse? No. But they hope that within Iran, it will be enough to trigger a political disaster, that it will strengthen the comprador and treacherous factions in order that Iran will then capitulate to the United States. That's the aim. And again, to go back, this is why Trump is in many respects a blessing. He blurts it out when Obama or Biden, or whoever wrote Biden stuff, or George W. Bush would nuance that. Trump gives it, its a proper explanation, which is that they are looking to isolate and destroy the revolutionary and patriotic elements within Iran and to boost the power of the comprador elements. That's what this strike was designed to achieve, together with the massive psychological warfare being waged. And the hope is that it will strengthen those elements that favor total capitulation to the US. That's what they hope. And this is what we can expect to see in the next few days inside Iran is not only the Israelis continuing this operation for as long as they can get away with it, but also things like waves of more assassination attempts, sabotage operations, terrorist actions, all of which is designed to undermine the confidence of the broader layers of the masses in the Iranian government's ability to defend the country. This is what is going on. Now, herein we will get to the point, but I will reiterate this, which is that I have said for quite some time that if the US did come to the point of launching an attack on Iran, it would be done in such a way as to avoid having to send an army in, because they can't do that. They hope that they can exploit the internal contradictions inside the Iranian system in order to trigger a governmental collapse or the pushing out of revolutionary and patriotic elements and the promotion of treacherous comprador elements, like the likes of the current president, Pezeshkian. And I'm just pausing here to do a bit of administration inside the chat. There we go. So the way in which this goes now it would be interesting to see. Now, it's not that the assassination of key figures just will cause the Iranian military to collapse. That's very much not the case. The way in which this will go is much more about the total picture, should we say, than individual isolated elements. So the assassination of key figures inside the military only matters if A, they are unable to be replaced, or B, the replacements are compromised in some way. So in all likelihood, the Iranians will have an ability to replace anybody who gets to the point of being like a senior commander, because senior commanders are always going to be very likely to be targeted by the US. So training replacements is not something which is shouldn't be too much of a problem. The wider problem is does the comprador element in Iran get strengthened by this? And the comprador element in Iran is still strong. I mean, you have a president who essentially represents the comprador, the comprador element in Iran, and the fact that they are not only there but also feel free to almost organize openly points to some of the very real contradictions that the Iranian government actually faces. And this is, of course, the US and the British and others know this very well. They do study the countries that they attack, and they are aware of the contradictions that are within them. They got caught flat-footed with regard to Russia because their information was out of date. They overestimated the power that those elements in the Russian system that are aligned with the West. They overestimated their popularity. They underestimated the strength of Russian feeling about the fate of the Russian majority areas in Ukraine, and also about the fate of Ukraine itself. So they got caught out when it came to that. Now, is their intelligence better when it comes to Iran? Well, possibly. The one story that emerged today was that that Israel or someone, US, Israel, maybe, working together, had managed to build like drone bases out in the deserts of Iran, through which they launched these attacks on Iranian air defense systems. Now, again, we will have to wait to see how true this is ultimately, but it does look as if this is something that they've actually managed to pull off, meaning that they've essentially built a system to launch attacks inside Iran under the noses of the Iranians for what must have been many, many months before getting this ready. So that points to problems within the Iranian system. It points to potential traitors in the Iranian system, and that the US has a lot of active spy and sabotage and terrorist networks running inside Iran, and that this has been a lot of the success of this US raid on Iran comes down to the active participation of these fifth columnists inside Iran in any attack. Because in order to learn the location of all of these senior military figures inside Iran, whose location should be at least a closely guarded secret, given the very sensitive areas of the Iranian military that these people oversee, in order to get hold of that information, yes, you could get it through a hacking operation. The US has certainly put a lot of time and effort into developing that. But to know where someone is at any given moment in time and to precisely be able to guide missiles in to attack them, well, you need human intelligence to do that. I mean, for all that the spy game has been technologically revolutionized, or gets technologically revolutionized every generation, the same old rules actually apply, which is that you need human sources of intelligence. You need people on the ground informing you of what is going on, keeping you up to date. And it's clear that the US has very extensive networks inside Iran doing just that, some of whom are old, like Mujahideen al-Khalq people, MEK, some of whom are Pahlavists, supporters of the old Shah, some of whom are like Balochi separatists, some of whom are Kurdish separatists, some of whom are just straight up traitors inside the government, inside the Iranian governmental system. But they all do exist, and they all can be activated at any given moment in time, which again points to a significant problem for anybody who tries to step outside of strict US control, which is that that is the Americans, the British, the French, the Germans, etc., might be compromised and might be unable to wage the kind of wars of conquest that they used to be able to do. But they can. Why would they need to do that when they can essentially exploit your weaknesses and pay for and bribe a whole subcontracted small army of agents to act on their behalf? And the only way you deal with that is that you have to shut down the networks of the imperialists inside your country. Right? The Russians have been glacially slow in moving to shut this down, but that after 2012, they did progressively move to shut down foreign influence inside Russia. And ultimately, this did bear fruit because the color revolution attempts inside Russia have all fallen completely flat since 2012. So whereas there have been successful terrorist incidents, including the Ukrainian raids quite recently, the color revolution networks inside Russia did get shut down. Now, some of them have been inside Iran, but it's clear that there's still a very extensive network of traitors and collaborators in Iran, without whom the US wouldn't be able to act in the way that it does. So it's clear that the Iranian government has a problem. There are, of course, certain high-profile examples of of this problem manifesting itself, including this recent attack, but also going back over a year to the assassination of former President Raisi. Now, there was an Iranian investigation into this, but unless I missed this, I've never seen anybody be brought to trial in Iran over the death of Raisi. Yet it was a clear case of an assassination. So why was nobody actually caught and brought to trial? Why was nobody held accountable? And even though it's quite clear that the US, Britain, Israel all had, I would guess, something to do with this, they would not have been able to carry it out without active collaborators, again, within Iran. And as long as you have active collaborators within Iran who can do things such as assassinating the president of the country, then Iran is going to keep having problems. And again, and then we go back to another thing we discussed on the latest episode of Decline and Fall, which is what is the role of the international organizations which the Iranian government has been trying to negotiate with, such as the International Atomic Energy Agency, in carrying out espionage for the US. And it's clear that the IAEA is essentially a compromised spy agency for the US, dressed up as a nuclear power monitoring organization, just as the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, OPCW, is compromised by US intelligence, just as the OSCE is compromised by US intelligence. There's evidence that came out from Donbass that the OSCE monitoring mission was providing the NATO side with intelligence about the Donbass republics, military capacities, and locations of key targets, etc. So all of these international institutions, with some of whom the Iranian government has been trying to negotiate with, the IAEA. Well, the documents that the Iranian intelligence services themselves just got hold of have proven that the IAEA is a spy operation running on behalf of the United States. So why on earth negotiate with that? Why on earth negotiate when the agency which is supposedly interested in monitoring your nuclear facilities is feeding back extensive reports and information to the US side, which will then use them to attack you? Why is anybody who aspires for their nation to be independent, even not even socialistic, but independent and outside of strict US control, why on earth would you want to negotiate with an organization like the IAEA? Why on earth would you invite them into your country? You're just inviting a giant spy operation into your country. We've known this for years. Take the example of the DPRK. The DPRK would negotiate with the US, or try to negotiate with the US, until they realized quite quickly that every promise the US made was broken really, really quickly, that nothing the US said could be taken seriously, and that the only objective the US actually had in mind was the destruction of the system in people's career. At that point, they went all out to actually get themselves to the point of being able to develop a nuclear weapon. Now, some say, of course, they had assistance from Russia. Maybe they did. In that case, it's good that they did. But the point is that they didn't negotiate with the US to the point where they were inviting like intelligence operations into their countries to view their facilities. They went all out to develop a nuclear weapon. They got one, and they now have enough with enough ICBMs, and it would develop to the point where they can actually hit the US West Coast. Now that is something the US imperialism is obliged to take seriously. So we come back to the question, which is that if Iran actually had nuclear weapons, then would the US be doing this? And the answer is no. So then we come back to the question of, well, why haven't the Iranians actually developed a nuclear weapon? And I don't believe for a second that this is about the fatwa of the supreme leader. It isn't. It's about contradictions within Iran itself. And if you want a really good rundown of these, I recommend the interview given by Bahman Azad on the ICSS YouTube page in a talk he gave several months ago, where he clearly outlined the contradictions inside the Iranian government and the weakness of that system, which is brought about by the bourgeois factions in Iran, and by the compradors, especially represented by Pezeshkian. And that's what the reason I think why Iran didn't go for a nuclear weapon is precisely that. There are elements inside the Iranian system, treacherous comprador elements with power inside that system, which want desperately, over and above everything else, to be able to integrate into the US system as, you know, the loyal caretakers of the of Iran, acting on behalf of US imperialism. That is a very real and dangerous group inside many countries, and they are present in Iran. And there we go. This is the effect of these people's activities. If Iran had actually gone out for a nuclear weapon and got one, then this would not be happening right now. That's the case. And the fact that they didn't go for the development of one has nothing to do with a love of peace. It has nothing to do with religion. It has nothing to do with fatwas from the supreme leader or anything else. It has to do with the presence of those characters inside the Iranian system who would sell the country down the river for the chance to make bank as the local administrators of a neo-colonial regime in Iran. And the fact that those people are present and still have enough power to block the development of things like Iranian nuclear weapons tells you a lot about the contradictions that exist inside Iran. And again, like, the biggest problem faced by any country that tries to extricate itself from imperial domination doesn't just, the problems don't just come from the imperialists. They're the source of many of the problems. Their aggression is to be taken for granted. Their frenzied and psychopathic attempts to bring any country that escapes their grasp back into their orbit and or destroy it, these should be seen as something which is standard operating procedure for imperialism. That's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem for any country trying to escape US domination is the presence of fifth columnists inside that country itself. That's the biggest problem, and the biggest problem which many countries face. Now, the DPRK deals with this very effectively. When they find some of these people, they arrest them and have them executed. The Chinese were faced with this problem over a decade ago when Xi Jinping first became leader. There was a much more extensive and well-developed network of traitors inside the People's Republic of China, many of whom were totally corrupt, compromised by the CIA and MI6. And so the Xi leadership instituted what's referred to as the anti-corruption campaign to shut them all down and to lock them all up and to kill many of them. And those are just the ones that we know about, thanks to the trials of these people. But there was a much wider intelligence network in play that apparently the Chinese wrapped up, arrested them all, killed many of them, and that's why part of the reason why the Chinese are able to give the middle finger to the United States, because they took out the human intelligence resources that the US and the British had inside China. Then they shut down very effectively the terrorist campaigns that the US and the British tried to run in places like Xinjiang or Tibet, or the color revolution attempts in places like Hong Kong. So you need to be able to shut down the internal networks that the imperialists rely on. If you can't shut those down, then you are at best going to be fighting with one hand tied behind your back, which is effectively where Iran has landed. Because these bourgeois elements, you cannot allow them to have the power to compromise the defense of the nation. Even if you're in a situation where you need to allow a capitalist class to exist for whatever reason, to allow them to have the power to compromise the defense of the nation leads only to events like this. And this is the problem. And this is something which needs to be more properly understood. Let's give another historical example. Why was it the case that the Soviet leadership took a huge risk in the 1930s by arresting and putting on trial the Trotskyite and Bukharinist leaders of the anti-party and anti-state conspiracies? Why did they arrest and execute people like Tukhachevsky? Well, because they found that these people had routinely plotted against the state and had moved into the active service of imperialism. And when this was found out, these people were correctly arrested, put on trial, and executed for treason when they were found to have committed these crimes. Now, this is vital for the defense of the Soviet Union against Hitlerite imperialism, because the Hitlerites were relying on the active sabotage of the defense of the Soviet Union by these fifth columnists. And these people not been rooted out and destroyed, then the Hitlerite invasion might actually have succeeded in forcing the collapse of the Soviet state. And again, this is part of the reason why the Chinese have taken the actions that they have in recent years. It's why the Putin-led government slowly, very achingly slowly, eliminated many of the sources of foreign influence inside Russia. Because if you tried to go for the kind of action that the Russians have taken inside Ukraine over the last 3 years, and you hadn't eliminated the power of the most naked comprador factions, and hadn't eliminated the power of the foreign intelligence operations to make much more trouble than they've managed to make inside Russia. I mean, what they've managed to do inside Russia is terrorist actions over the last 3 years, but they haven't managed to summon up any sort of color revolution type attempts. That's been squashed politically and judicially squashed by the Russian state. So for those who say, oh, Putin's this or Putin's that, or he's weak, he's collaborating with the US, I don't agree with that. If you look at the actions that the Russian state has taken over the last 10 to 15 years, they have been progressively eliminating the sources of foreign influence and the sources of strength that the intelligence agencies have inside Russia, which is why they've been able to conduct this war in the way that they have. By no means is the Putin system perfect, but they have shut down a lot of the foreign intelligence operations that weakened Russia for so long and including shutting down the British Council, which is a British intelligence operation in every country it operates in, dressed up as language teaching, etc. So again, this points to the need for contradictions in Iran to be resolved. And until those contradictions are resolved, Iran's going to keep having problems related to traitors and sabotage networks, terrorist actions, etc. Because unless you deal with these people properly and give them the fate that they so richly deserved, then you're going to keep having these problems. Again, the biggest problem for any country is to when trying to free itself from US domination or US British domination, is actually enforcing the sovereign writ of the government inside the territory of that government and eliminating sources of foreign influence. Now, every time you try and eliminate sources of foreign influence, these people will wail and cry and stage protests and try and exploit internal tensions. But that's why ultimately only the dictatorship of the proletariat itself can actually secure a nation against internal problems, because only with the mass participation of the working class and more broad masses inside in the governmental functions of a country, and only the consistent mobilization of the masses in defense of the country can actually act as the ultimate insurance against the counter-revolutionary attempts that are made by the internal collaborators with imperialism. So, for instance, to use a more modern example, why is it that Venezuela and Nicaragua survive repeated US attempts at coups, color revolutions, etc.? It's because they've built a source of power, which is, of course, the power of the masses, the politicized and mobilized masses themselves, that has a significant influence within that society. These aren't socialist societies by any means, but there is a revolutionary process going on there, which part of which relies upon the consistent mobilization of the proletariat and peasantry in Venezuela and Nicaragua, that is able to counteract the attempts at counter-revolutions in those countries. It is only with the mobilization of the masses that you have a consistent ally in support of your national project. This is the truth, and a problem emerges, of course, when you have a government that might well wish to establish independence, but which is still beholden to bourgeois interests who are mortally afraid of the mobilization of the masses. This leads to problems ultimately. But those who successfully are able to mobilize the working class and peasantry in defense of the revolution or the independence of the country, they can shut down attempts at subversion of a nation pretty quickly. Now, here I'll return to the point about, is this is the US making a mistake? Is this going to lead to longer term problems? Well, ultimately, it won't resolve. I doubt it will resolve any of the issues that the contradictions the US is facing. Now, it all depends upon in the next few hours and days if the Iranian government can be put in a situation where it has to respond seriously, because if they let the US openly destroy their military hierarchy and hit loads of their military assets and don't respond with anything at all, then that will fundamentally weaken the Iranian system. Now, I don't claim to be able to see within that system or discern what is going on, but my guess is that there's probably an almighty row going on inside the Iranian system between the revolutionaries, genuine nationalists and patriots, and comprador types who want to ring Donald Trump and beg for mercy. That's what I think is probably going on right now. We must hope that those who are revolutionaries, who want to continue to secure the independence and sovereign development of Iran, prevail over the treacherous elements. And this is the contradiction that exists inside Iran right now. Now, as for the US, I mean, and if I was an Iranian revolutionary, what would I say in these arguments? I would say that the attack that the US has carried out is the absolute most it can do, other than, of course, unleashing nukes on Iran, which they don't think the US is going to do. But the only thing that is going to be able to, you have to be aware of the limitations of US power and not allow themselves to, through their propaganda, to hype themselves up to be all powerful. The fact is that this strike that the US has delivered via its Israeli proxy is a powerful one. It has killed an awful lot of important people inside the Iranian military hierarchy, but it's not devastating thus far. Again, this could change. It's not managed to knock out the Iranian nuclear program. It's not managed to, as far as we can tell, fundamentally compromise the Iranian ability to defend the borders of the country. This is a big air attack and ground attack from sabotage units that has caused damage, but I don't think it can be seen as being a fundamental existential threat to the Islamic Republic. The existential threat would come if they don't respond properly, which would lead to more internal problems for Iran, internal problems which are rooted in the continuing existence of a comprador bourgeoisie. So let's not fall for what is an obvious psychological operation here. The obvious psychological operation being the attempt to reassert the idea in everybody's mind of like US utter dominance, and the idea that they cannot be defeated, they can strike anywhere, they can hit anyone, they can do anything they like with no responses. That has to be punctured. Yeah, we have to return to to an embrace of the full implication of Chairman Mao's statement about the US imperialism being a paper tiger, precisely because it is unable to launch an invasion of Iran. It's unable to launch an invasion of Russia. It's unable to launch an invasion of China. It can't do any of these things. Imperialism succeeded in its earliest days and up to today because it was able to effectively play upon the internal contradictions of its enemies or the peoples and nations that it sought to subjugate. That's why British imperialism succeeded in India for so long, because in its early years, it was able to effectively play on the divisions of the decaying old Mughal Empire. And once the Indians started rising up against it in an organized fashion, that was the point where things started to go wrong for the British. Like if you look at like wars of independence against the colonial powers, what ended up happening was that in places like Algeria, as we've covered many times before, the French killed 1 million Algerians inside just over a decade and still lost the war. So the point was, though, that French imperialism had been made to pay a price that the French population found unbearable and was not prepared to tolerate anymore, leading to an instability and ultimate collapse of the French Fourth Republic and the imposition of de Gaulle's effective elected dictatorship, I think is the best way you can put it. Same is true for, of course, the long Vietnamese liberation struggle. Imperialism can kill an awful lot of people, but what it can't do is tolerate a long-term military campaign. It can't do that. And again, the defeat delivered to the Americans by the heroic Vietnamese people still speaks volumes as to the limitations of imperialism. Imperialism has been pushed into waging war in this specific way. And this strike that the US has carried out on Iran speaks to the fact that the US is actually getting desperate. Now, they usually wouldn't take the chance even of having the Israelis come out and do this openly. They'd much prefer underground, plausibly deniable terroristic operations. You now have the US president openly saying, hey, we lied to them. We lied to them about the negotiations. There was no negotiations. We were always going to do this. So again, Trump coming out and telling you the truth that many other US presidents wouldn't actually do so. And the fact is that the whole the whole system inside inside the United States is also teetering on the edge of a crisis. Again, to go back to the crisis-riddled nature of imperialism, they require the collapse of Iran, Russia, China, and any other country that actually resists them. They require the return of Iran to neo-colonial domination. That's the root of all of this. Some people have said it's about Iran's support for the Palestinian resistance. That's a part of it, but it's not the root of it. The root of it is the 1979 to 80 Iranian revolution. And for all that I am by no means a Khomeinist, why would I be? I'm a communist. But the removal of Iran from foreign domination is what they're seeking to address. They're seeking to push Iran back into being subjugated by US imperialism and British imperialism. That's the point. That's the point of this strike. That's the point of this whole operation. And I would say that the US has gone a very long, it's gone much further than it previously would, though it has been escalating in its hostility towards Iran because the nature of the crisis facing the US has got worse. So you've had like an underground and hidden terror campaign against the Iranian government and Iranian military and scientific facilities and individuals for many, many years. And that escalated with the killing of General Soleimani. And it's escalated again now. And again, it's a reflection of the desperation of the US ruling class. They are pushing and pushing and pushing for the Iranian system to be destroyed. And they want it to be destroyed from within. They can't destroy it from without. Israel, as an expression of US power, can target a lot of places. The US itself can target a lot of places, but they can't invade. That would be too difficult. And they can't overcome Iran by military means. So they have to do this kind of operation, which is designed to cause a crisis in Iran itself and to cause the collapse of the Iranian system by convincing people in Iran that the crisis facing them is much more existential than it actually is. If the Iranian government pulls itself together and is able to do two things, I would say. First of all, gather its strength and root out the compromised forces inside its own system, because it's clear that they've got a real problem with that. And second of all, to be able to deliver a response to the US aggression that has to, of course, target Israel, but also will have to go further than that. Now, the late Hassan Nasrallah did say a long time ago now, well, over almost 2 years ago now, I think. It was late November 2023 when he said that the struggle started on October the 7th is a struggle to remove the US from West Asia. And his words then were correct, and they remain correct to this day. This is the point. Nasrallah understood the nature of that struggle, and ultimately his understanding of it, I think, cost him his life. But it is about the removal of US domination within West Asia. That's what the struggle has always been about since the US took over the role as the lead imperialist power in the region from the British if we're going to be generous, we'll say 1956, following the Suez disaster. And so that's ultimately what this is all about. And unless you understand that this is about the ability of the US to dominate the region, and Israel is just one part of a much broader strategy the US is pursuing, then you're always going to run down a blind alley, basically. If you think that this is about Israel, then you're wrong, quite frankly. Israel is a tool. Israel is a tool of aggressive US imperialism. As US imperialism gets more desperate and more aggressive, Israel gets more desperate and more aggressive, because the crisis of the two are interlinked. There is no Israel without a US. US, there might be a US for a while without an Israel, but without the ability to subjugate West Asia, then US imperialism would be fundamentally and irreversibly damaged. So this is very, very high stakes stuff. And so when you see foolishness like this, like that, which I'm going to share with you now, where are we? Let's have a look. Not the Donald Trump thing. Let's just, yeah. When you see someone like Rania Khalek say, have any American political leaders condemned this insanity? I've only seen sociopaths cheering in silence. That in itself is a very foolish thing to say, because the actions of the US leadership are not insane. The Lindsey Graham and Tom Cotton and every other, crank and psychopath inside the US House of Representatives and Senate is cheering this on. He's not insane. It makes complete sense. It makes complete sense for them to cheer it on. It makes complete sense for them, for the US imperialists to continue to be endlessly aggressive towards Iran, because Iran is the one that got away, and it remains via its commitments to Hezbollah and its commitments to Ansar Allah, even though these are not Iranian puppets by any means. It remains something of a center of resistance against US domination, which is why the aggression makes sense. Like, these wars are not insane if you're looking at this from the point of view of the US ruling class. If you're looking at this from the point of view of the US ruling class and the British ruling class, looking to retain their domination in West Asia, then an attack on Iran, again, one done using Israel, makes complete sense. Why would any US politician condemn it? Why would any US politician condemn a regime change operation launched against Iran when they've been trying to do that consistently and failing for 46 years? Why would they hesitate to praise it now? Why would they not see this as a great victory for themselves? Again, this is the kind of stupid stuff you get from people who are supposedly anti-imperialist, but just collapse into moralism and wailing and weeping every time something goes wrong, and every time the US reminds everybody that it is still a dangerous imperialist force. This is the problem you get with a lot of people who are nominally anti-imperialists, is that they don't seem to understand what the nature of imperialism is. I think someone like Hassan Nasrallah did understand it, which is why he was killed. This is the thing. But the actions of the US are not insane. They make complete sense from the point of view of the US ruling class. And this whole operation is about securing the dominance of the US over West Asia for another decade, another 20, another 2 decades, another 5 decades, who knows? But that's the prize, and the prize is enormous. Because if they lose this, if they lose Israel, if they lose their ability to project power and create chaos inside West Asia, then that is essentially, if not game over for US imperialism, but an incredibly severe blow. If they lose this and they lose in Ukraine, that is 2 very severe blows. So when faced with that dawning realization that they've got real problems and they need to address them, the US is going to be absolutely as aggressive as it possibly can be, and in this phase when it's threatened with defeat. Just because imperialism is a paper tiger doesn't mean it's not dangerous. And of course, it's going to use every tool at its disposal to secure its continued dominance. So we can expect more things like this. We can expect more blood-soaked and ruthless actions. We can expect more proxy wars. We can expect more terrorism. We can expect more horror unleashed by the US imperialists and the British to try and maintain their influence. But we shouldn't be fooled by this. The very fact that they have to use the Israelis to do this and risk a severe Iranian retaliation against Israel, when Israel is already about as unpopular as nettle rash on the ball sack, this is an incredibly risky maneuver that the US has engaged in, and which could ultimately lead to the destruction of the Israeli regime. Could, I'm not saying it will, it could. And also the losing of their influence inside West Asia. But the fact is that they are getting to the point where they are desperate enough to try and roll the dice on a regime change operation in Iran, and in the hope that something comes off. There's no guarantee that it won't. If the Iranian government doesn't get its fucking act together, then they might succeed. I don't think that the Iranian government will collapse, though. I think that there's still enough organized support of the Islamic Revolution inside Iran to stop street attempts at color revolutions. I think the problem for Iran lies in its hierarchy, and it lies in the lingering influence of the bourgeois and the comprador bourgeoisie especially. And until that's resolved, Iran's going to continue to have problems. But we will now pause for a question and answers. Let's take a look here. F. Alba says, Israel is a tool of American imperialism, as you say, but behind all of these flags, there's a flag with a wolf in sheep's clothing, wouldn't you say? I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. Speak in plain terms or don't speak at all. Right, here we go. Let's go back up to the top. This is going to be edited highlights. ALM says Brian Berletti has cited that Brookings paper for years to explain the continuity of agenda. He pretty much draws the same conclusions as I do, but without the ideological clarity. Well, look, it's like Brookings is just one institution that writes sort of think pieces for the US sort of brains trust, should we say? But yes, like they always required the return of Iran to the Western camp, and they're trying to force that. This is the thing, you know. T.G. Wilson says 2 Israeli C-130 J-30 aircraft were seen flying at low altitude this morning in Daraa, southwestern Syria, possibly repatriating Mossad operatives from Iran. Gulfstream, Nashon, AWACS were also seen. Probably true. Svetlana says House of Representatives Speaker Mike Johnson said today on X that Iran will face serious consequences if it attacks US interests in retaliation to recent Israeli attacks on Iran. Well, that's just typical imperial hypocrisy. We're allowed to hit you however hard we like, but don't you dare hit back, you know? SW Haster says, realistically, what can Iran do? Retaliating will mean going to war with the US. I don't know if Iran has any choice other than being strategically patient. There are choices, in my view. There are choices because the strategic patience basically means getting your infrastructure destroyed, getting your leadership wiped out, and encouraging the internal reactionary forces. So Iran does have choices. Because bear in mind the limitations on what the US can actually do. The US at this stage cannot actually, and I don't think it could realistically pull together an invasion force to hit Iran. Nor can it continue its current aerial bombardment campaign indefinitely. It's the US has gone all in on this because it has limitations on its power, and this is something that should be kept in mind. Right, let's go through some more comments here. Right. Muzzle Paint says Syria was a dry run for a war in Iran. Well, it was all part of the same plan. Right. Hang on. It all part of the same idea. I mean, let's also bear in mind that the Syrian collapse. Why did that system collapse? Now, yes, the principal problem with it was that the Syrian government had been under siege for many years by the imperialists. There had been, a civil war unleashed inside Syria by imperialist proxy armies, including the likes of HTS, who are now, of course, in government in part of the shattered remnants of Syria. But what actually caused the Syrian collapse? It wasn't clever, cyber warfare operations, that they are part of it. What was the root of it? The root of it was that the Syrian bourgeois figures within the Assad government changed sides. That's what finally caused the complete implosion of the Syrian state, and the influence behind that was the Gulf states. The Gulf states were the ones moving a lot of money around and buying people inside the Syrian system. And that is eventually why they managed to hollow out the Syrian government to the point when the attack came. It was barely resisted because essentially they'd won via political maneuvering what they hadn't managed to win on the battlefield. And that's why things collapsed. It was the US and the British managing to exploit internal weaknesses inside the Syrian system when they hadn't managed to win on the battlefield. And again, this is what they hope to do with Iran. They don't want to actually get involved in a toe-to-toe fight with Iran because it wouldn't go very well for them and they can't wage it. What they want to happen is internal disintegration. That's what they want. That's the only way they can actually win. Do I think that Iran should target a couple of American targets in the region? Well, we don't know for sure what's going to happen now. My view is that if there is a response, and there will have to be one, it'll be one that targets Israel. And this is entirely correct because, like, if you the Israeli system is still in crisis. That's the thing, and it will remain in crisis. And they still haven't managed to win in Gaza. They still were unable, despite the decapitation strategy, they were unable to overcome Hezbollah in Lebanon. And they have achieved acting as the wielder of the spear for the US imperialists. They have managed to achieve a big propaganda victory. Let's not underestimate the size of the propaganda victory they have won on this. But it is not one that on its own should cause state collapse in Iran. I don't think that it will. We will see a few days of reorganization inside Iran and hopefully the hunting down of any internal traitors that they have. But there will be a response. I think it will be focused on Israel. And if it's one that is extensive and again removes the propaganda win that the Israelis had, then that's the Israeli regime right back into crisis again. And again, that poses a fundamental problem for the US. So I think that they'll focus on these Israeli targets, and there's plenty of targets to choose from. The Iranians have, like, as they've been saying over the course of the past few days, extensive intelligence on the Israeli nuclear program and on other things as well. So the Iranians have a real choice about what they can do. If they go after the Israeli regime and cause it to lurch into a further crisis, that you are also going after the US at the same time. But by focusing on the Israeli regime and not going after US military assets in the region, then they would actually trigger a further crisis for the US itself. Because what you would have, if I was Iranian, what would be my choice of action? I'm trying to think on the hoof here. First of all, you would want to deal with your internal security problem, because it's clear that Iran has an extensive internal security problem. You would want to wrap up and shut down any US-run intelligence networks and traitor networks inside your country, and you would want to do it rapidly. You would also want to mobilize support domestically for a response against Israel. And you could only do that by making an appeal to the broad Iranian masses, which I would say that I wouldn't say that Pezeshkian is particularly capable of doing that, but that's what you should do. You would also need to send a signal to Iran's allies in the region that a response is forthcoming and to coordinate with it. Then you would need to pick the elements within the Israeli socio-economic system and military system that would be the most damaging to hit. And you would need to prepare the masses inside Iran for a potential American comeback when you did carry out this assault. But what you want to force from the American imperialists is for them to come out from behind the curtain, which they've already pretty much done, but you force them really to commit their own forces. That's what would need that is what I would think would need to happen. Because what you want to force inside the United States is you want to force the contradictions inside the American position wide open. And the contradictions inside the US position revolve around its relationship with the Israeli regime. If you want to force the US politicians to go out into the open and start arguing for the deployment of the US army to, I don't know, invade Iran or something, and to force to justify themselves to their own population as to why they're carrying out acts of aggression against Iran, and for them to stop being able to hide behind their proxy. So if the Iranians hit targets in Israel hard to the point where it pushes Israel into a new crisis, forces the US out into the open to try and defend their Israeli proxy, then that will be the next stage. But the thing is, all of this revolves around the idea that the Iranian leadership is unified and determined to carry out some kind of response. Whether they are or not is yet to be decided. Never underestimate the dangers of bourgeois traitors inside any country. Never underestimate what they are prepared to do to secure profit for themselves. The compradors inside Russia were prepared to sell the country for literally like pennies on the dollar to the United States and to the British. The Iranian compradors are no better. They would sell Iran for pennies to the US in return for a nice villa in Tuscany and the right to go and bid on pieces of impressionistic art at Sotheby's every summer. This is the nature of these people. So, and as long as they have influence within the Iranian system, then that's going to continue to be a problem. So where are we now? How much of Iran's retaliatory capability has been destroyed? Asks Mike Priest. In all honesty, I don't know. We won't know until a few days have passed. Arcane Eclectic says we shall see how strong American support is for Israel when Americans are forced to fight and die for them. Well, that's the point when the American support for Israel evaporates, I think, because you can't go out and try making the case that to defend Israel it is necessary to suffer for the US population to suffer mass casualties, because that's not going to be a case that flies. It just isn't. The words of Chairman Mao are correct, which is it is the weakness of the links with the masses that makes the US imperialist regime weak. That's the problem facing the imperialists. Right, just going and seeing some more comments here. Arguments about the killing of the Romanovs. Well, you know what? If you're going to weep any tears for the death of an autocrat and his wretched family, then you have no place here. Please remove yourself. Yes. So, okay. We got another comment here from T.G. Wilson who says, Matt Kennard posted earlier that Britain has admitted is training Israeli army terrorists in Britain now, and that 20,000 Americans serve in the Israeli army. Well, at least 20,000, maybe, I don't know, maybe slightly more than that. But again, this points to the role of Israel, which is that it acts for the US-led imperialist bloc, including Britain. It continues to act for Britain and the British ruling class way long after the US took over the leadership role in that relationship. Its actions against Iran are expressions of the interests of Britain and the United States and the imperialist ruling classes both. So it's absolutely correct that Israel gets support from the entire collective West because it acts on behalf of the collective West, just the same way Ukraine does. Right. Okay. So I'm going to be drawing things to a close here for tonight. I will be back with you again tomorrow to see what the latest is. Thanks to all 740 of you who have tuned in. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. We'll be back with you again tomorrow. And now I'm going to throw you back over to your musical outro.
We